Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress, Chapter 10. Calistico. Calistico. Large, colourful fabrics hung suspended over the room, beckoning Ravses inside to examine it further. Sheets of light, translucent fabric cascaded from the ceiling, overlaying each other in haphazard crisscross fashion, and creating layers of boundaries to step through as one moved through the room. It reminded her of the Unscavian market in Eindungzirk, back in Norschlan. Colourful carpets, rugs, and animal skins covered the floor, and the walls were draped with woven tapestries and banners of intricate multicoloured designs. Overall, the room was a kaleidoscope of mismatched patterns and dazzling colour combinations. Like a sponge to water, the surrounding fabric soaked every sound made within the room, creating a bubble of thick, dense silence with a palpable membrane in the room's single doorway. Leaving and entering the room felt like transitioning between realities. The room seemed to be a large study that also served as a quiet meeting room for sombre conversations and clandestine deal-making. Two leather-upholstered couches faced each other with a long, low wooden table between them. When they entered, Piecora lit a lamp resting on a table, illuminating an ink bottle and several quill pens and two smoking pipes in a circle of light. Several other chairs were here, each richly upholstered in dark leather with gold studs and rivets. The carved legs of the chairs and couches mimicked the likenesses of beast legs on thick, clawed feet. Ravses held Autor's hand, while Piecora stood behind them. Valesh was next to Piecora, and behind Autor with her hands on his shoulders. The four of them stared up at a large, heavy curtain of gold, blue, grey and white swirling paisley pattern draped over the plaster wall opposite from the doorway they entered through. It hung from an iron rod nearly 60 metres high. "I don't see it," said Valesh. "Autor, do you see the little people? And the boats?" asked Ravses. Autor walked to the curtain and pointed up at specific points within the intricate pattern. "Yes, there they are," Ravses said. She then stood behind Autor, raised her hand to the curtain and said, "There is a story here, within the pattern. Up top, boats sail across a flat sea for a very long time. The boats find different places, make discoveries, meet other people, and then leave to voyage again. They finally find a river, and midway up the river they lay anchor at a port. There is only one boat left at this point, and the remaining voyagers leave the boat and mingle with the people of the town. Eventually a large castle is made, and the town grows around them. Many riches befall." She stopped talking as she came to the bottom of the curtain, the end of the story. Ravses looked back at Valesh and said slowly, The people from the boat, they find great wealth." Valesh furrowed her brow. "How do either of you see any of this? I only see shapes and colours." "As do I," said Piecora. Ravses straightened up and looked at the curtain, now up close. "I see the patterns too, but I also see the story, the pictograph, nestled within the pattern. Are you sure you don't see that?" Both Piecora and Valesh shook their heads slowly, indicating their negative response. "I wonder, is this the story of the Calistico?" Ravses asked. She then grabbed the side of the curtain and walked it across the wall to the other side, revealing the hidden wall behind. They all jumped in sudden fright at the hideous screaming demon face painted in a realistic fresco on the plaster behind the curtain. Its deep blue skin contrasted with its red eyes and white pupils. It had large pointed ears and two long curling ram horns that grew from the person's dark widow-peaked hairline. Its expression was that of an exaggerated scream, with its gaping mouth covering the wall from the floor to the top of Ravses's head. Sharp yellow teeth lined the mouth with garish fangs on top and bottom. The painting was so realistically executed that it looked as if the face was trying to push itself out from behind the wall, as if the wall was another veil or sheet hung from the ceiling. After they recovered from their fright, Piecora lifted the lamp from the low table and approached the wall fresco, looking it over closely. "We didn't see your story in the curtain, but we sure as stag see this," mumbled Piecora to herself. Valesh sat heavily on a chair facing the wall and crossed her legs. "I don't understand," she said softly to herself. Artur went over to her, put one of his little hands on her forearm, and pointed to the painted face with his other. "We're not that scary. We're really not," he said, like a child reassuring a sibling. Ravzizi looked around the room in wonder. "This is the only room we've found that is inspired by the Unskavia, and we had to go so far to reach it. These fabrics are from Unskavia. I can smell the Unskavian dye on them. Whoever put all this together wasn't just faking it. These fabrics were brought here from Eindungzirk." "Ravziz, come over here," said Piecora. "There is a groove here, in the wall where the mouth is. I can feel air coming from it." Ravziz looked at the seam in the wall, and together with their fingers she and Piecora traced the outline of an arched pair of panels, the size of a small door, set inside the wide-open mouth of the screaming devilkin face. "It's a door of some sort, I think," Piecora said in a hushed voice. "How do we open it?" asked Ravziz. Piecora ran her hands along the wall, around the painted mural, and Ravziz did the same. Slowly they drifted apart until they reached the corners without finding anything. They looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders. Then Artur crawled on all fours on the thick layers of carpets until he reached the wall. Ravziz rolled her eyes. "Artur, you're not a baby anymore. Use your feet." "Wait," Piecora said as she crouched next to him. Artur was digging his hands between the carpets and the wall, trying to pull them up. "Help me with this," Piecora said as she gently lifted the boy and placed him back over to the chair that Valesh sat in. Then she started lifting up the edges of the carpets, trying to separate them from the wall. "Valesh, bring the light. Ravziz, what do you see down there?" "Anything?" Piecora said as she grabbed the carpets with both hands and pulled up and away from the wall. Since the carpets were heavy, large, and many-layered, she could only lift them a little bit. Even with all her strength, she still couldn't see the bottom of the wall where it met the hard floor. Valesh joined them with the lamp and hung it over Piecora's hands, while Ravziz knelt to her knees and peered into the dark seam between the wall and the carpets where Piecora lifted them. "I see... Wait. There. I can see symbols, lettering. Shift the light toward me, Valesh." Finally, Ravziz pulled her knife out, the one she obtained in Knightsport, and she began cutting at the edges of the carpets. Piecora pulled her own hunting knife and did the same, while Valesh continued holding the lamp above them so they could see. A while later, Ravziz leaned back on her haunches, breathing heavily and sweating. Her forearms ached as she worked at massaging her cramped fingers while surveying their work. A crude square had been cut into the layers of carpets where they lay against the wall, revealing more of the hideous fresco mural. But now, exposed for the first time in generations, was the bottom of the open mouth, and beneath the mouth were fine calligraphic letters written in the Unskavian language. Ravziz looked back at Artur and asked, "Artur, how did you know about this?" "Ikki told me, Mummy," the child said. Ravziz blinked twice and shook her head. "Ikki? Who is Ikki?" "My friend," said Artur, and then he climbed into the chair where Valesh recently sat. "What does it say?" asked Valesh, shining the lamplight over the script. Ravziz continued to watch her son with puzzled concern, but then she returned her attention to the words on the wall. Piecora used her hands to brush aside dust, cobwebs, and accumulated filth. After a deep inhale, she blew into the freshly cut square, clearing it out and making the words easier to see. "This has been here for a very long time," Piecora said to herself, her eyes roaming over the mural. "It's an old Unscavian script," Ravsez said as she peered at the lettering. "It uses ancient words and spellings. The language has evolved a lot since this was written here. We use shorthand now for a lot of this. It reads, 'The threshold is sealed against friend and foe, except for the blood of Calistico.'" Slowly Ravsez and Piecora looked up at Valesh. "What? What am I supposed to do?" Valesh recoiled from them, taking the light with her and plunging the lettering beneath the carpets into darkness. "Somehow this door will open only for you," said Ravsez. She could see that Valesh was very frightened now, as if everything that she lived for up to this moment had come crashing down on her under its full weight, and none of it made any sense to her. Valesh continued backing away slowly until she leaned against the chair where Aurtor sat. "I don't know what any of this means," she said, waving her free hand around her wildly. "This place, this room, this God's awful, hideous thing painted on the wall. I don't want any part of this." "It doesn't matter what you want," barked Piecora loudly as she quickly stood up and glowered at the young girl. "You're a part of this, whether you like it or not. And here you are. Maybe everything you ever dreamed of is on the other side of that wall. Or maybe it's all very different than you wished for. Maybe everything you ever wanted was a delusion you created for yourself to help you face each challenging day of your life. You created an ideal of the Calistico fortune, a fanciful notion of your family's wealth and reputation that fit within your limited worldview based only on your young years. And that gave you something to aspire to, so regret nothing. It brought you all the way to right here. Well, now is the time to separate reality from fiction, girl." Piecora stepped closer to Valesh, who cowered and moved behind the chair. "We need to get through that wall. We need to find answers. And we need to get the hells out of this place, Valesh. None of this may be what you wanted, but it's still yours. You are a Calistico. You cannot run from it." Valesh whimpered from behind the chair, reduced to a little girl equal in age to Aurtor. "I don't know what to do," cried Valesh, tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared! I'm scared!" Just then, Aurtor straightened up and turned around on the chair, stood on his toes, and threw his little arms around Valesh's head. Ravsez heard Valesh sobbing into her son's shoulder, overwhelming her with her own emotions. Piecora looked at Ravsez with exasperation. Then she walked over to Valesh and took the lamp from her, setting it onto the floor in front of the wall and the ghastly mural. "What does this mean?" Piecora asked Ravsez. Ravsez tore her gaze away from the two children, looked up at Piecora, and thought for a long moment while wiping away her own tears. "Well, if I know my own history," she said, "we've never been one to indulge in hyperbole much. The further back you go, the more this becomes true, and this looks like this was made a very, very long time ago. Generally speaking, with something like this, if the word blood is used, it's usually not metaphorical or allegorical, but it's literal." Then she sighed as if admitting defeat to some inner conflict. "Whether we like it or not, the Unscavia have a hideously dark past." She gestured toward the screaming face on the wall. "Yes, that is us. It's still true that the painting makes use of exaggeration and stylization to induce fear into the viewer, of course, and is evocative of Unscavian art from hundreds of years ago. But nevertheless, this is also true. We come from devils. Each one of us, every single Unscavian, is from some bloodline that mingled with devils in ancient times, long before Canonia was here. It is who we are and always will be." Piecora looked back at the two children. They were both now watching them, with Valesh draped over the back of the chair and her arms slung around Aurtor. "Well, that's that then," Piecora said, throwing her hands up in the air. "I'll not be sacrificing any children today, so we keep searching this damnable place for a way out." She picked up the lamp, just as Aurtor led Valesh by her hand over to the wall, right up to the twin panels within the screaming mouth. Piecora paused, letting the light shine on them. Artur looked up at Valesh and asked, "Do you trust me?" Valesh shrugged her shoulders lethargically and sniffed while wiping her face, still recovering from her outburst. Artur turned her hand palm upward and unsheathed his own little knife from Knightsport. Immediately Ravsez was on him, her one hand on his shoulder and her other taking the knife away. "Artur, what are you doing?" she demanded. "Moo me," he whined. "Fine, you do it then." "Do what?" Ravsesi asked. Artur showed Ravseza Valesh's open palm and said, "Just a little poke in the middle. Don't hurt her, Mummy. I'll do it if you don't want to," he said. Ravseze looked up at Piecora, wild with confusion, but Piecora only raised her eyebrows and shrugged. Then she looked at Valesh, and Valesh returned her stare through her long, messy, straw-like bangs. The girl seemed utterly defeated and exhausted. "Mummy, this is how to do it," pestered Artur. "Make just a little dot and then go from all the way up top to all the way to the bottom. She's not tall enough, so Piecora needs to lift her up." Ravsez looked back at Piecora for any help at all, and Piecora knelt down beside Artur, put her arm around him, and asked lightly, "Are you sure this is how we do it?" Artur nodded his head. "What makes you so sure?" asked Piecora. "We don't want to hurt Valesh." "We won't hurt Valesh, don't worry. Ikki told me. This is how to do it," he said. "Artur," Ravsez began, "who is this Ikki of yours?" "I told you, he's my friend," Artur said impatiently. "When did you meet this friend?" asked Ravseza. Suddenly Valesh took the knife from Ravsez's hand and pierced the skin of her own palm with the point of the knife. She winced and squeaked in pain, but then turned to Piecora and said, "Hurry, lift me up like Artur said." Ravsez saw a tiny trickle of blood running down the little prick in the girl's palm before Piecora placed the lamp on the floor and hoisted Valesh up to the top of the seam of the twin panels within the screaming mouth painted on the wall. "Put your hand on the groove and slowly drag it down to the bottom," said Artur, stepping back. Valesh did as she was told, placing her palm against the seam between the two panels. Then she slowly ran her hand down the plaster wall, while Piecora lowered her, until they both came all the way down to the very bottom of the seam. Valesh stepped back next to Artur, blowing hair from her face from the corner of her mouth. Piecora handed her a rag and said, "Wrap your hand so it doesn't get infected." Just then came the sound of heavy stones grinding together, and slowly the two panels began to open inward. The room vibrated slightly, causing the hanging drapery to sway here and there. Piecora and Ravsez were met with a gust of stale air from the other side, as the two stone panels finally came to rest on either side of the small arched doorway, now open to them in the middle of the wall, and the screaming mouth. Slowly, Ravseza turned back to Artur, and he smiled back at her as he leaned his head against Valesh's waist. "Told you, Mummy," he said proudly. That was how to do it. Ravseza sighed heavily. "One day you will outgrow being so adorable," she thought to herself, "and I'll not be so disarmed by it." But then she quickly dismissed these thoughts, knowing that once these years had passed, they would truly be over, and she would never have this version of her son again. Her heart melted, and she reached out to him and kissed his cheek. Then she put her arm around them both, and holding Valesh's hand she asked, "Does it hurt? Hold the bandage tightly on it." But Valesh ignored her, gazing into the dark maw of the screaming devil face on the wall, frozen with fear. Ravsez looked into the doorway and saw only the darkness. Then, facing Piecora, she said, "You get her. I'll get my son. Here, I'll take the lamp." Piecora knelt in front of Valesh and lifted the girl onto her back, and Valesh wrapped her legs around Piecora's midsection. Ravsezi did the same with Artur, picked up the lamp and shined it into the mysterious hidden doorway. "We have nothing to fear, milady Calistico," said Ravsese. "This is your home and we are your guests. Let us go see where this leads." Deep inside of her, Ravsez knew that this upswell in courage had its source in her new friend, Piecora, whom she had grown deeply fond of by now. As they stepped through the doorway, she met Piecora's eyes, who looked back at her excitedly, and Ravsez instinctively winked at her. It was a little thing, but such a coquettish gesture would have never crossed her mind before. Perhaps she owed that to Piecora too. Ravsez and Piecora, each carrying a child on their back, slowly and carefully crept down a steep stone stairway in total darkness, except for the lamp that Ravsez held in front of her, illuminating each step as they descended. The air was noticeably colder down here, and smelled of wet earth. The space around them felt large and open. Sounds travelled far more freely down here than they did in the mansion above. Finally they reached the flat, cold stone at bottom. The lamplight revealed dozens of large crates and sacks full of supplies and dried foods. Here and there were tools strewn about on the ground or leaning against the crates. One crate was opened, marked with the device of Enigrad, a dolphin leaping from a cornucopia, revealing meticulously stacked glass bottles of Enigradan wine. Several empty bottles were set on top of the crate. They silently crept onward in what Ravsez guessed was a large storage room for supplies. Finally, after a long while in the darkness, constantly trying not to trip or stumble over stray shovels, pitchforks, lifting straps, boxes and sacks, and piles of straw, a light began to emerge ahead of them. A small oil lamp similar to the one Ravsez carried rested on a large barrel next to the opening of the supply room. The walls, floor, and ceiling on this level beneath the mansion comprised bare stone carved deep into the earth. The air was cold and damp, and various distant sounds echoed from the subterranean darkness. Occasionally, something splashed or landed with a metallic clang in the deep, obscure distance that reverberated around them throughout the lair. Piecora lifted the lamp from the barrel, and together she and Ravsez, each with a child on their back and carrying their own lamp, continued into the cavernous corridor outside of the supply chamber, staying near to the stone wall on their right and occasionally stepping into puddles of ankle-deep cold water. Briefly they felt a subtle shudder in the stone floor beneath their feet, and light clouds of dust gently fell from the darkness above. Vestiges of the mansion's wealth upstairs seemed cast aside down here, or placed temporarily without care for presentation or placement. Here and there they encountered a hanging banner or tapestry, or a stack of leaning framed paintings against the wall, or random piles of arms or pieces of armour that mingled with tools, barrels, and pieces of cut wood. For a long while there were no other rooms down here beside the main corridor and the supply chamber they came from. No one spoke as they slowly crept along the rough stone wall of the cavernous corridor. To Ravsez, it felt like hours had gone by since they passed through the screaming face in the wall of the Unskavia room above, and she wondered if they were still beneath the city, or even within Canania at all. Finally, far ahead, they perceived a faint flickering light spilling into the main corridor from the wall on the right. Orto slept as he travelled on Ravsez's back. Valesh held Piecora's antlers as if steering the sea engine, her chin resting on Piecora's braided head and her feet locked in front of Piecora's torso. Upon reaching the light, they found an opening in the wall large enough for several people to enter, while the cavernous hall they had been traversing continued on and downward into cold darkness. Peering around the corner of the opening, Ravsez and Piecora saw a thickly carpeted room strewn with papers, documents, and scrolls messily tossed everywhere. A long green velvet upholstered couch sat against the wall on the left, and a large desk of dark wood and several shelves on the right. On the opposite wall from the opening, a natural stone hearth was carved into the wall with a bright, healthy fire burning within, providing dry warmth to the room. On either side of the hearth stood two marble statues, a male and female, both with the signature tails, horns and ears of the Unskavia, each posed in relaxed contrapposto. Over the large wooden desk hung a flat trophy cabinet with a glass lid featuring a large, blank parchment, old and stained, and fraying at the edges. Several wooden cabinets stood next to the desk, and next to the couch towered an ornate armoire expertly crafted from dark wood, although cracked and dented, as if it had been transported, dropped, and dragged many times. In fact, all of the wooden furniture inside the room was exceptionally mastercrafted and beautiful, but worn down and distressed by heavy wear and tear, water damage, and great age. In the far right corner of the room, next to the male Unskavia statue, stood a full suit of plate armour, complete with mail and greaves, shield and sword, and crossbow. Emblazoned on the shield in beautiful polished lacquer was the harp and wave device of the Calistico. In the opposing corner on the other side of the hearth, next to the female Unskavia statue, was a doorway that led to another room. Quietly, Ravses and Piecora let the children down and bade them to sit on the couch and not move from it. Falesh sat at the end of the couch, pulling her feet up and tucking her knees beneath her chin, with her arms wrapped around her legs. She watched as Orta silently played with his rat-catcher toy. Another shudder ran through the floor, this one louder and more pronounced. Dust fell from the ceiling high above, and an ink bottle rolled off the desk and onto the thick carpet. As Ravses looked around the room, she noticed how various items filled it all over the place, reminding her of Roltin's sagery and his study in the back of his shop. Piecora walked over to the desk, going through the drawers and sifting through papers. Ravses, on the other hand, felt drawn to the hearth, so she slowly crossed the carpeted floor and stood in front of the female Unskavia statue. She reached up and touched a horn on the statue's head, while slowly stepping around the statue, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. Then she moved to the male statue and gazed at the exquisitely sculpted marble. The statue seemed very old, with little cracks and chips here and there, and the edges and corners were rounded down from erosion, as if they stood outside for many long years. Something glinted in the corner of her eye, and turning, she saw something gold in the centre of the stone mantle of the hearth, just above her head. Walking to the centre of the hearth, and feeling its dry warmth on her belly, she reached up with her right hand and felt a small, delicate metal ring, warmed by the fire. Plucking it down from the mantle and holding it in front of her face, she gazed at the ring with open wonder, her eyes wide despite their sensitivity to the bright light of the hearth fire. She held in her delicate pale fingers a gold ring set with a small, multifaceted red jewel, like a ruby except dark in colour, like polished, coagulated blood. Its edges and planes reflected the firelight in tiny, dazzling glints of every colour of the rainbow from the surface of its crimson core. As if from a great distance, within her mind came the sounds of rushing waves, cracks of thunder, disintegrating stone, and screaming people. She stared blankly into the fire as a rupture appeared before her, consuming everything around her in a colossal vortex of clouds and debris the size of an entire city. The earth beneath her shook and rolled, and criss-crossing ravines appeared beneath the maelstrom, spouting jets of flame and molten magma, spewing hot, glowing particles high into the air. Then, for as far as the eye could see, all of the ground fell away, as if through a gold panner's sieve, and the maelstrom above grew to encompass the entire sky, circulating with tremendously violent forces, like a giant millstone of black, roiling clouds. The very horizon sunk down into the broken, separated earth, and then something too large for the eye to capture in a single view, and the mind to capably conceptualize, and too horrifying for one's sanity to allow, began to emerge from the vacated cavity like a titanic birth of cataclysmic proportions. Its shape was rounded like the top of a colossal head the size of an island, and the air rippled above it with atmospheric oscillation and streaking black clouds of alien ether never before seen in this world. Lightning of every hue in the visible spectrum crackled around the penetrating monstrosity from the swirling storm above, as superheated air ignited from strange new elements and compounds being introduced to the world for the very first time. But as vast and distant the open wound in the earth was, the intruding thing was even larger, and the ground heaved upward as the horrific entity strove to break through the thick, multi-layered striations of the world's geological surface, threatening to tear the very world itself apart. All at once and from all sides came the towering walls of water from the surrounding seas, their heights hidden in the clouds, and they came down upon the emerging horror with such catastrophic force that it fell back to the domain from which it came, and the seas poured into the gaping crater, filling it and consuming everything that once lived there. "What did you find?" asked Piecora closely from behind Ravsese while touching her arm. Ravsese jolted back from her vision and found that she was wearing the ring on her left middle finger, and despite her immediate efforts to remove it while scrambling for a response, it wouldn't budge. "Oh, nothing really," she said nervously, suddenly noticing she was perspiring heavily. "Are you sick? Maybe you should lay down," said Piecora with concern in her voice. She held her fingers against the side of Ravsese's neck. "Your heart is racing and you're burning hot. What happened?" I'm fine. Really, I am," Ravsese protested weakly. Feeling Piecora this close comforted her like a cool breeze in the shade on a hot day. "Just standing too close to the fire, I guess. I think this place is really starting to get to me. Did you find anything interesting?" "Yes, I think so, but I cannot read it." "Let me show you," Piecora responded. Piecora led Ravsese over to the desk, where a long document rolled out from the desk to the floor. "What do you make of this?" asked Piecora. "It looks like the contract Rultin showed us, back in his shop, the one for the museum." Ravsese quickly identified the document as an article of lineage with a central vertical line down the middle of the parchment with perpendicular and angular branches listing names and dates. Outside of the diagram were historical notes and details, critical to the context and formation of the collected lineage being represented, weaving a narrative throughout the document that spanned across many generations of time. The document resembled the deed to the museum that Rultin showed them in his study in what felt like an entire lifetime ago. Flowing vines and flowers decorated the sides, and at the bottom, the harp and wave device was illustrated in the same fashion as the museum's contract. At the top of the document was the title Of the Harp and the Wave and the Origins of Calistico. Ravsese shivered as she began reading through the details of the document, finding that the introduction and beginning portion of the article were written in the same classic Unscavian language as the riddle written on the wall beneath the hideous fresco painting in the mansion above. "Harfund fell, the harp and the wave," she said softly to herself as she read on. She looked up at Piecora and said, "This early part, it's Unscavian, classical, like the script written on the wall beneath the hidden door. It talks about a ship called the Harfunvel, or the Harp and the Wave, in the Low Canonian common speech. It was a name that they adopted as their family name because it unified them after years of sailing across the seas. They each came from all different families, but they eventually called themselves Harfundvel, and the ship. Their mother, for they couldn't survive without her. This unified identity helped them survive for all those years, as it kept them from tearing each other apart." "Who is they?" asked Piecora. "Unscavians, all wealthy servants of wealthy Muthan masters who either saved their earnings or stole from those they served," answered Ravsese. "These Unscavians were very intelligent, educated, articulate, and had high status among Muthan society back then. They could walk freely in Norshlan among the Muthan humans outside of Aendungzerk's walls without being attached to a human master or guard or chaperone. They could even conduct business of their own to a limited degree so long as they didn't commit any crimes, and they did not smuggle anything in or out of Eindungzirk, or aid in any way their kinspeople within the Unskavia district. They might have even been considered peers among the Muthan noble class. Still not free, still serving their masters, but they wielded power that no other Unskavians had, and were afforded luxuries, indulgences, and allowances that no other Unskavian could dream of. I've read books on these people, but only during my stay in Eindungzirk, when Arthur was born. For any literature, song, art, any reference at all to these Unskavia is outlawed in Muthan society. I never knew about any of it while I lived and served in House Veklish. These Unskavians, despite their positions of influence and trust, they left the peninsula, but not like the rest of us. They had several ships commissioned and built for them. At first, I thought I was reading about the Lost Sojourn, which is an old Unskavian myth about a fleet of ships that escaped Muth to seek a land of their own, to rule as their own. But that is an old myth occurred far, far earlier than this account. If you believe the myth of the Lost Sojourn, of course. Anyway, the Harfunvel, the Harp, and the Wave was the last surviving ship after sailing the seas for many years, and eventually it came here, to Alagost, and dropped anchor for the last time of her long, nurturing life. Ravsez noticed that Valesh had come over to stand with them and gaze at the document. "Can you read any of this, Valesh?" Ravsez asked. Valesh crouched down, squinting at the lettering on the document, and said, "No, I never went to school and my parents never taught me." "Well," Ravsez began, "prepare yourself then. This article is full of controversy, and if it's legitimate, it could change many things, many significant things." "What happened when the Harfunvel arrived in Alagost?" asked Piecora. "They stayed below decks for a while, as they were Unskavia." Ravsez gestured with her hand around her face and horns. "But they sent 3 into the city who covered their appearances, and they changed their name from Harfundvel to something more Canonian, Calistico, which was a combination of the family names of the 3 emissaries that first made contact with the Canonians in Alagost. They were eventually granted audience with the king and queen, and they agreed to terms of citizenship that included relinquishing the Harfundvel name in favour of Calistico, although they were allowed to keep the harp and the wave as their device and heraldry. In this way, through a network of human messengers, brokers and intermediaries, all of the remaining Unskavians who sailed together on Mother, the Harfunvel, were able to gain citizenship and earn licenses to legally conduct business in Alagost. They soon became involved in all matters of trade, and they learned to control the entire transactional flow of commerce, from importing and manufacturing to exporting and delivery, and all points between. They established shops and fronts all over the city, selling and trading every kind of good and service you can imagine. They even established trade with Muth and imported exotic wares from their fellow Unskavia in Eindungzirk to sell in Alagost, which would then make its way to Coast Haven and other Canonian cities for even larger profits on the commissions. Over time, they finally left the ship, found homes, and soon began accumulating wealth together until they solicited the throne for the permit to build Domusithre Entia Flus Thumai, home of the harp and the wave, within the heart of the city and the centre of their influence. Their ship, their mother, was scuttled, but every piece of her was brought into the city and incorporated into the foundation of the Calistico mansion and fortress. Valesh stood and looked up at Ravsez, tucking stray blonde hairs into her linen cap. "Are you saying that, according to this document, your people are my ancestors? How is that possible? We look nothing alike, and there's just no way Alagost would allow such power to be given to people who don't look like us." Ravsez stifled a rebuke, knowing that Valesh didn't mean any insult by her words. Besides, it was a valid question. She read the document further to find it contained the answer. For a long time, the Harfunvel Unskavia, who were now called the Calistico family, hid themselves behind human intermediaries who brokered deals, conducted business, and spoke on their behalf. These trusted humans kept their secrets safe, and over time, this trust grew close kinship among the Unscavians. They became part of the Calistico family, and gradually the humans and Unscavia married and made new families of their own. Generations went by, and slowly the Unscavian traits, our tails, our eyes, our horns, they diminished until they were all but gone and forgotten, becoming indistinguishable from humankind over the last few generations. Ravsese playfully touched Valesh on the nose. "You and I, my darling, are related, although very distantly most likely." Valesh rubbed her nose thoughtfully, then raised her sad eyes to Ravsese and asked, "Then, why did it all go away? What happened to them? To our family?" Ravses was touched so deeply and unexpectedly at hearing Valesh include her with her reference to our family that for a moment a lump formed in her throat and she couldn't speak. She sighed, regained herself, and looked back down at the very bottom of the parchment and said, "That I do not know, young Valesh Calistico. This document merely traces the families and names of those who arrived from Muth after many years at sea, became the Calistico family as citizens of Canonia, and their rise to mercantile power. I believe whatever caused their downfall occurred after this document was written. But there is something at the very bottom here that might provide a clue, or perhaps a portent, to their downfall. At the very end, there is a name that connects to the Calistico line from no other source. Eindonjevangshen, it is called. I have no idea what that means, except it is the same name that is on the deed to the museum from the Calistico Family Trust. Rulton talked about it when he showed us the contract that he witnessed and signed along with the mayor of Coast Haven and the Calistico representative. Remember what he said? He'd never seen the name Eindonjevangshen before, but assumed it was a longer version of the man who now rules over the Calistico family, Eindon Vandus. For some reason, the representative added it to the deed, but no one asked about it, so enamoured they were by all of the gold filling the mayor's office. She looked down at Valesh and said, "The rest is what you already know. Many blame Eindon Vandus for the fall of the Calistico family. He lives off of their inheritances while they live in squalor across the whole country. And those who meet him, they tend to forget about him. Hard to believe it's even the same man as today, as this all happened so long ago." Valesh looked down and said sullenly, "I hate him." A long silence brewed between the three of them, while Autor was enraptured in his rat-catcher toy, until Piecora suddenly spoke. "Why did they leave in the first place if they lived such good lives in Muth? Is there nothing that can be given to an Unscavian that would outweigh, or at least compensate for the value of freedom for them?" asked Piecora. Ravsese paused before answering, quelling a dozen primal responses that rose to the surface from the depths of her being, until finally she spoke. "First, let us rid ourselves of the notion that any Unscavian lives a good life in Eindungzirk or Muth, no matter who they serve and what favours they're allowed. No Unscavian is free while in Muth, not then and not ever, and yes, freedom is the only thing we want. No amount of transactional indulgences, riches or favours could ever replace this fundamental need in each of us to dictate our own fates and live our own lives, governed by our own laws, led by our own leaders. We, the children of humans and devils of ancient times, have never been free, and we have never had a land of our own to cultivate, nurture and bear fruit according to how we choose to live our lives independent of any authority but our own. But to answer your question, what these Harfundvel Unscavia were able to achieve is simply mind-boggling, requiring precise coordination, cooperation, timing, luck and wealth. How they were able to orchestrate just sailing off on their own fleet of ships is simply beyond my comprehension. And this alone makes me ask the same question as you do. What compelled them to leave?" She shrugged her shoulders and said, "I have no..." But then she stopped as something caught her eye while facing the glass cabinet above the desk. Clumsily, she climbed onto the wooden desk, slipping on papers and knocking over pens and knickknacks until she pressed her face against the glass and peered around the edges of the parchment. She turned her head around to face Piecora and asked excitedly, "Do you not see this? The bordering around this paper?" Something in her face startled Piecora, and Piecora backed away and shouted with great alarm, "Your eyes!" "Whatever do you mean?" Ravsesi asked, still kneeling on the desk. She looked down at Valesh, and Valesh recoiled like a frightened child. "Valesh, back away! Now!" Piecora barked loudly, her hand suddenly gripping her hatchet at her belt. Ravsesi's heart broke, seeing Piecora suddenly treating her like an enemy. No, a monster. Piecora's eyes were wild with fear and anger as her Xianjian spirit boiled to the surface and responded in the only way it knew when confronted with whatever she saw in Ravses at the moment. She had forgotten what this felt like. But to receive this treatment from Piecora, someone she was becoming deeply fond of, made her heart sink to the floor. She shifted her weight and sat heavily on the desk, sending more items to the floor. She didn't want to frighten them any more than they already were. "Piecora, why are you being like this?" she implored. "Do you not see what I see?" "You are possessed!" Piecora shouted, still backing away until she stood in the opening to the large corridor beyond. "Valesh, come over here now." Valesh ran over to Piecora and hid behind her. "Piecora, please, stop this," beseeched Ravsese. She hopped down from the desk and took a step toward them, hands outstretched. Piecora furrowed her brow. "What happened to your eyes just now?" Ravsesi was absolutely flummoxed. She looked over at Artur, who now watched everyone like a child watches their parents arguing. "Artur, what is wrong with my eyes?" she asked, waving her hand in front of her face wildly. Artur grimaced and pouted his lips, comically looking like an old man admiring at a complex piece of engineering. "Nothing, Mumi," he said. Ravses turned back to Piecora and Valesh, who were slowly walking back toward her. "For a little while there, your eyes, they were," started Valesh. "They shined, as if lit from behind. Bright red they were," said Piecora, staring into Ravses's eyes with an expression of great concern. "Not anymore. It's gone now. But you looked like a beast of the night whose eyes glow in the firelight." Something then came to Ravses, something that had been nagging her for some time now. "Upstairs, looking at the curtain, Artur and I could see things you could not see," she said. She pointed to the parchment case on the wall above the desk and said, "Look at the parchment inside that case and tell me what you see." Piecora turned toward the parchment and said, "Nothing. Just paper." "Me too," said Valesh. "It's blank. I wondered at what possible value it could have when we first entered the room. Now, watch me as I look at it. Hold the lamp close and tell me what you see. But please don't be frightened if you see any changes. I am not possessed by anything other than the person you've come to know." When she turned to look at the parchment again, almost immediately marks appeared in the paper as if bleeding wetly from behind. The marks were only around the edges, a delicate border design of interwoven curving lines and sharp corners, and between the border and the edge of the paper was fine calligraphic lettering. She heard both Piecora and Valesh gasp. Looking back at them, they stared at her with fear and amazement. Piecora lifted the lamp and slowly moved it around Ravses's delicate, pale face. The brightness of the lamp hurt her sensitive eyes, but she strove to keep them as wide open as possible. "See there," said Piecora. "Your eyes glow from within, becoming more obvious as the light draws nearer. They are like round gems lit from within, and the lamp's light increases their brightness. See, when I pull the light away, it is barely noticeable." You can thus see something more in the paper? Asked Valesh. Something we cannot see. Yes, said Ravsis, slowly nodding and returning to the parchment. A beautifully inked border around the edges by a delicate hand, and lettering outside of the design. She turned her eyes to Valesh. You do not see any of it? Valesh slowly shook her head from side to side. Ravsis felt Artur now standing next to her, and she lifted him up onto the desk. Artur, look at the paper up there and tell me what you see. But listen to me. When you look back at me, Mumi's eyes will be different. Don't be frightened. Nothing is wrong. The same thing is happening to you. And yet you are still Artur, as I am still your Mumi. You and I can see things others cannot, apparently, although we haven't quite figured out why or how. As she expected, Artur's eyes began to glow in the same way that Piecora and Valesh described. A red iridescence appeared in the very pupils of his eyes, like glowing discs emitting a soft red light, like skin lit from behind, responding to the direction and distance of Piecora's lamp. He pointed around the edges of the paper. Lines, Mumi, around the edges, like someone is drawing them right now. What does the lettering say? Asked Piecora, now standing close beside Ravsisi. Ravsisi's heart mended by the simple question, knowing its indication meant trust and friendship with Piecora had been restored. She leaned forward, pulled Artur close and rested her chin over his shoulder. Let me see where it begins. Up top there, I believe. It reads, Hidden is the way for seekers of sojourn, except by the moonlight that shines through the stones. 3 moons for 3 paths, and the stones that were torn. When 3 moons united, and new life was born. There is a mark here at the end of the last line indicating there is more to this song, meaning this isn't the end of it, said Piecora, finishing Ravsis's sentence. There's more to it, which means there must be more. Ravsis began to finish Piecora's sentence but trailed off as her eyes grew wide in sudden realization. This is... Oh my... winds and clouds of the sky. I think this is a map of the lost sojourn, Ravsese said, and a shudder went up from her tail to her back and straight to the tips of her wide pointed ears. Piecora looked at her and said, Or one of many. As you said, this isn't the only one. But how is it a map? Do you see a map there? Ravsis looked back at her, barely containing her excitement. No, I don't see anything in the middle, but that's by design. It's intentional by the sojourner cartographers, hidden even from our sight without a moonstone. It's blank because... Oh, my heavenly rain. Artur. Do you still have that pretty red gem? She lifted Artur down onto the carpet as he plucked the red gem from his pocket. He then wiped the black soot from his fingers on his shirt. Oh, thank the air that I breathe, gushed Ravsis. Piecora, can you please remove the case from the wall? Piecora motioned for Valesh to stand on the other side of the desk, and together they gently removed the case from the wall and set it down on the carpet. They tried to open it, but it was locked. Damn, of course it's locked. The key. Where is the key? Said Ravsese, filled with excitement. Piecora quickly rummaged through the desk, until finally lifting a small key from underneath one of its many drawers. She inserted the key into the case, and the glass lid lifted silently open. Ravsis caught her breath while holding the red gem that strangely floated between her fingers. Then she lowered it to the parchment, but Piecora grabbed her wrist and stopped her. Wait, she said. Do you want to smudge the paper? Remember, we only see Mathan Blackrock. That stuff is soft, crumbly, and very messy. Mathans burn the stuff for heat. But now I see your eyes glowing again when looking at the Blackrock. You're using that sight again. How did we not notice this before, when we first found Valesh and Artur playing chess together? Ravsis sat back, as her mind slowly decelerated to a more cognitive rate. And silently, she thanked Piecora for her assertiveness. You're right, she said. Of course you're right. We need to separate the gem from the stone. And it wouldn't work anyway without the moon overhead. Do you know about the moonstones? Both Valesh and Piecora shook their heads in the negative. Another story from myth, like so many others that seem to be materializing all around us lately. They are tied to the lost sojourn, in that... Well... Ravsese struggled to know where to begin as her mind tried to collate all the many outlandish tales from the lost sojourn myth that she learned throughout her life. Finally, she felt like she could efficiently explain the central theme. Basically, a long time ago, long before the Harfenvel left Muth, 3 ships fled the peninsula carrying the Devilkin before they were called Unskavia and before Eindungzirk was established to contain them. 3 ships sailed in 3 different directions to find a land that they would live and rule themselves, welcoming only our kind who should ever find them. We don't know anything about what happened to those 3 ships, although there are many fanciful tales written about them. Oh, we love talking about the lost sojourn, as everyone seems to know a different story or a different take on it. Nowadays, we all accept the stories as our own folklore to brighten our days and lift our spirits. It's a matter of Unscavian pride, as it's all ours and no one else. Tales of drama and heroism, comedy and tragedy. The Lost Sojourn is its own genre among the Unskavia. Even mentioning it during mundane conversation will draw a dark smile and laugh, because ultimately it's about hope born in futility and nihilism. The Unskavia have largely accepted their fate as a dying people, and there's nothing we can do about it except live as freely and expressively as we can during the brief moments we are alive. We know we cannot survive forever caged within Eindungzirk, no matter what intentions the Muthan lords have. One day, we will be gone and forgotten, either suffocated and snuffed out within Norshlan, or bred out by mingling with non-Unscavians for those who escape Muth, like the Calistico. There's nothing we can do about it, so when we bring up the stories of the lost sojourn, we laugh and we cry. Ravsez took a moment to recalibrate her emotions, then continued. Anyway, back to right here and now. This is what I know about the root of the lost sojourn stories. That 3 ships left Muth and sailed away to some distant land to establish their own community free from oppression. Or they each came to their own bitter ends, and that was that. No one knows what happened to them. But according to the central myth, maps were made by those who left, and they hid them throughout Eindungzirk for any Unskavian to find them. They appear as blank pages, like this one, but with the use of a moonstone, the map will be revealed, but only if the moonstone corresponds with the full moon overhead. A red moonstone for the red moon, a white moonstone for the white moon, and so on. But the tale is cautionary, for the maps were drawn not just in one ink, but all 3 inks for each moon, drawn over each other or woven into each other. So, if you only use a red moonstone beneath the full red moon, you will only see the aspects of the map drawn with the ink corresponding to the red moon. If you have 2 stones, say the red and white, and both are out in the sky, and full or near fullness, you will see 2 aspects of the map revealed. Of course, this is true if all 3 moons are out and are prominent in the sky, but that is so rare I don't think I've seen that in my lifetime. But no one knows what the correct answer is. Of all the paths drawn over each other on a single parchment, only one is correct. The others lead to peril. The sojourners were very protective and secretive about their intended destinations, and that's the third thing. Who's to say they ever made it there and weren't waylaid, or found somewhere better to call their new home? Once they left Muth, there was no way for them to change the maps. So, we always joke with phrases like, "I know where I'm going like I'm following a lost sojourner map." Because even if we plot everything correctly with the right stones and the right maps and the moons are aligned to show us the true path that they intended, we still may not find them, for they simply might not be there. That is a lot, said Valesh slowly. I've learned more about Muth, Unskavia, and my own family today than in my whole life, and I don't think any of this is known in Canonia. Why is it, then, that you and Autor can see things that we cannot?" Ravsesi shrugged her shoulders. "I have no idea. It's not a typical Unskavian trait, or we would have seen it in others by now. You might have seen it in Vinexi, but I guess you haven't. No, this is something different about us, the two of us. I haven't quite pieced that together yet." They all sat on the floor together looking at the blank parchment before them. Autor reached for the stone, but Ravses withdrew it and said, "No, son. Mumi's going to hold on to this now. I promised to find another pretty stone for you." "It was for you anyway, Mumi," Autor said, and Ravsesi hugged him tenderly. "Finding the map here," said Valesh, "may shed some light as to why the Harfunvel left. Maybe they tried to follow the lost sojourn." "Very possible," said Ravsesi. "They were all wealthy scholars. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was an expedition to find the sojourners. I wonder what happened to the other ships in the fleet then. The Harfunfell came here on its own, as if it was the last remaining ship. But what if it wasn't? The other thing is this. Using the map requires moonstones. The only one we found here is this black rock." Piecora sighed deeply. "This is indeed a lot. For all of us. I am an outsider here, as none of this affects me. But I am still tasked with getting you and your son out of Canonia safely." "I know," Ravsesi said quietly, as she leaned down and removed the parchment from the tacks that secured it to the velvet backing. She began rolling it delicately. "You may be separate from everything we've learned here, but you are also integral to us. None of this would have been possible without you. I feel we will always be in your debt long after this is over." "Let's find a scroll case to secure that map so it doesn't get ruined," said Valesh, hopping up and walking away to explore the room further. Ravsesi looked at Piecora and smiled Piecora smiled back, lifting her eyebrows and rolling her eyes sheepishly, and this lifted Ravsesi's spirits, as she couldn't remember seeing her friend smile before. Ravses had truly never met anyone so unabashedly self-realized as Piecora, and so unafraid to express herself to anyone regardless of their station, wealth, race, belief, or any other quality that people tend to prop up and hide behind. She just didn't seem to care about any of it, or didn't know how to, and this made Ravses trust and adore her all the more. "The question still remains, perhaps now more intriguing than ever," said Ravses to Piecora. "Who is living down here?" "And how do we get out?" said Piecora. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.